At Central Christian Church, we are growing together in our understanding and our faith. We are touching lives with the love of Christ, and we are sharing our gifts within and beyond our congregation. We are glad to share our Sunday morning messages with you. We hope you will hear a word of comfort and encouragement for your life. May God bless you and grant you peace and joy.
By the age of 10, Catherine began high school because she had academically outpaced her 4th, 5th, and 6th grade school peers and her junior high school classmates. Mathematics was her passion and her extraordinary talent. Born in 1918 in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, Catherine Johnson excelled through high school, and at 15 years old, she enrolled at West Virginia State College. At 15 years old. At age 18, she graduated summa cum laude with a Bachelor of Science and in degrees in mathematics and French. As a woman, and as a woman of color, Catherine was limited in her abilities and opportunities to pursue her calling as a research mathematician. And so she took a job teaching school children in her neighborhood. According to the Smithsonian Institute, as America stood on the brink of a Second World War, the push for aeronautical advancement grew ever greater, spurring an insatiable demand for mathematicians. Women were the solution. Ushered into the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory in 1935 to shoulder the burden of number crunching, they acted as human computers, freeing the engineers of hand calculations in the decades before the digital age. Sharp and successful, the female population at Langley skyrocketed, said the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian also reports that though the pressing needs of war were great, racial discrimination remained strong, and few jobs existed for African Americans, regardless of gender. That was until, they say, 1941, when A. Philip Randolph, pioneering civil rights activist, proposed a march on Washington, D.C. to draw attention to the continued injustices of racial discrimination in our nation. With the threat of 100,000 people swarming to the Capitol, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, preventing racial discrimination in hiring for federal and war-related work. Honored recently during the celebration of the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the now famous Tuskegee Airmen gained their wings to fly hundreds of sorties and successful missions to be the first black pilots in the United States Air Force during World War II because of President Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802. Roosevelt's order also cleared the way for the first black computers, slide rule in hand, to make their way into NASA history. Catherine Johnson began working for the predecessor of NASA in 1953 as new fighter jets built on the calculations of the women computers before her at Langley were deployed in the Korean War effort. These women were both ordinary and they were extraordinary, says Margaret Lee Shetterly, who in her book Hidden Figures shines a new light on the lives and accomplishments of the so-called West computers. Women of color, like Johnson, who worked in segregated spaces, were not allowed to live in the same dormitory for white women serving at Langley from the 1940s all the way into the 1970s, when the only reason they weren't there anymore is because the digital age had arrived, and the computers could calculate in nanoseconds what they were able to do in the hard and diligent work they had done. Katherine Johnson aided America in winning the space race for NASA, calculating the flight trajectories for the first American in space, Alan Shepard. And for Neil Armstrong's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, when they landed on that moon in 1969. 60 years later, Katherine Johnson finally received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama in 2015. 60 years later. Without the gifts and talents of all the women computers working before the digital age of calculations per nanosecond, so much of what we take for granted, like our cell phones, those little computers in our pockets, right, and communication devices, they would surely not be where they are today without the work of people like Katherine Johnson, because, my friends, there would have been no satellites and GPS and communication systems without our ability to get into space and put them there. History is the sum total of what all of us do on a daily basis, says Shetterly. We think of capital H, she says, history, as being those huge figures: George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Martin Luther King. Even so, she explains, you go to bed at night, you wake up the next morning, and yesterday is history. Yesterday is history. These small actions, in some ways, are more important, or certainly as important, as the individual actions by the towering figures of history. From Isaiah 49, or as we learned during Advent, hopefully, from 3rd Isaiah, speaking to the exiles that were returning back to their homeland, we find these words. We heard some of them in the call to worship this morning. Listen to me, O coastlands. Pay attention, you peoples from far away. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, he made me. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver, he hid me away. And he said to me, You are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and for vanity. Yet surely my cause is with the Lord, and my reward with my God. And now the Lord says, who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God has become my strength, he says. It is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. from one of the 4 servant songs that we're going to encounter over the next few weeks, the prophet is clear that it is God who calls God's servant, in this case Israel, to not only be restored, but to be given as a light to all people, for the purpose that God's gift of salvation may reach, in a flat earth worldview, the end or the edges of the earth. We may say with Neil Armstrong, Shepard, and with Katherine Johnson, across the globe, all across the globe. What if Katherine Johnson's amazing talents had been left exiled somewhere because of the color of her skin? What if she had not been restored to serving her nation by the stroke of a president's pen? What if those Tuskegee airmen had remained only mechanics and base techs in exile on segregated bases, grounded from the privilege of flight because the melanin in their skin was deemed somehow less than worthy or capable of piloting the very aircraft they built and tore apart and rebuilt and serviced every single day? Like Israel, they were restored. Well, almost anyway. To live out the amazing gifts that they had been given. It is also clear from Isaiah's song and the text we heard from Paul's letter to the fledgling Corinthian church that God is the source of our gifts to serve. For in every way, you have been enriched in him. In every way. In speech and knowledge of every kind. Just as the testimony of Christ has been strengthened among you, so that you are not lacking in any spiritual gift as you wait for the revealing of our Lord Jesus Christ. Broiled in conflict, lacking competent leadership, facing huge challenges in the midst of the Hellenistic and Roman cultures of ancient Greece. The young church of Corinth surely felt like the talented young Katherine Johnson, working through many barriers and graduating from college with seemingly nowhere really available for her to go. You know, it's like you and me. When we're faced with the enormity of the problems in the world, or even in our own little tiny pieces of it, when we're faced with illness, a new diagnosis, an old diagnosis, a new treatment, the end of treatment, when we're faced with loss, those beings and human beings who are so special in our lives. When we're faced with anxiety about our future, am I going to make it through this week, this month, this year? Are my kids really going to get through graduation and on? Are they ever going to move out of the house? Are they ever going to come back home? We may be tempted when we're faced with problems in life and challenges to just hang our hats on the hooks, throw up our hands and our arms and say, no more. No more. I'm done. No more. I hope what you'll hear today is the powerful call of God to be God's servant. The servant Israel in Isaiah 49, or the servant of the church in Corinth during Roman occupation. The servants like the West Computers and Katherine Johnson, and the Tuskegee Airmen, and so many others who faced enormous barriers and problems and challenges in their lives, heard a call to keep going forward, a call to not say no more. I hope you'll hear that same call today, to be God's servant right where you are, whatever you are walking through this day. You, each and every one of you, are being called by God, our Creator, who knew of our awesome potential as servants of love and grace in this messy human family before we were even born. Because God didn't create humanity to be a mess. God didn't create humanity to fail. God created humanity to know love, to know grace, to know peace, and to know abundant life. And so God, who loved this world so much, even as messy and out of sync as it can seem, God came into our very existence, into our presence, revealed God's self in Jesus, experienced the messiness of God's own creation, walked dusty roads, got dirt between his toes, ate things he loved, and spit out some things that were just nasty. Found people whom he could trust, and met those who would shake your hands and stab you in the back on the way out the door. He found us, imperfect, impassioned, all of the things that describe us as humanity. Messy, real humanity. And then he did something that was so amazing. He laid down his life. He didn't hang his hat on the hook, throw up his arms, and say no more. Somebody else stretched out his arms for him. Instead, he lived his life for others. He gave up his very existence so that you and me, even now, even us, may know that God's love is beyond anything we have ever experienced in this life. We get glimpses, we get little taste of it, we feel it once in a while, but it's so much bigger than that. So I hope you will hear the powerful call of God today to be God's servant right where you are, right here, right now. Because God calls you now to carry with you that same grace, the same sense of generosity and faithfulness and honesty and hopeful endurance, the compassion and the myriad of gifts of encouragement you hold in your heart and your spirit because you follow one who gave them all to you freely and only calls you, follow me, follow me. Follow me. Let us be a light for all people on a daily basis, because yesterday is history. Amen.